The theme of Sunset Boulevard is simply how corrupt Hollywood can be, how mean and heartless the town may be, how people will do anything to get ahead there, even if it means sleeping with a has-been who's creepy and demented. It's a story of Hollywood. The original opening of Sunset Boulevard was actually quite different than the one we see in the film. What it was the LA County morgue with a bunch of dead bodies under sheets with little toe tags on them. And Holden is wheeled in, and he's placed there, and conversations begin to occur between the corpses.
Apparently, what they did was they took the film out to show it to some audiences and to get a reaction, and there was this laughter.
Wilder described it to me, and he described exactly what happened with the audience, that the detail that got the audience roaring with laughter and just killing, the mood, the intended mood, was two characters in the morgue are talking to each other.
It really went down from there. They didn't get that it was supposed to be kind of funny. They thought it was hysterically funny.
It doesn't come off that way when you read it, but apparently in visualizing it, it does. So they said, oh my God. And they completely changed the opening.
At the beginning of the film, we see police cars driving into a driveway, and then suddenly, as if out of nowhere, we see a corpse floating in the swimming pool. But we see it from a really peculiar angle. We see it from down in the pool looking up at the dead body with a little bit of blood trickling out of its chest. It was difficult to shoot, and it's one of the few instances where Wilder does call attention to the shot as an image. It was difficult to film. They didn't know how to film with an underwater setup because I don't think they really had the equipment. So they had to shoot it from above, but how? So what he told the camera operator was, I want it from a fish's viewpoint. So the guy went and built a tank and experimented with dolls and mirrors and shooting. And it turned out if the water was something like 40 degrees and no higher, because that would cause distortion, they could film it from above, the camera at the edge of the pool, looking down at a mirror, and in the mirror was reflected the image of William Holden. What's great about it, too, is that it's distorted enough that it doesn't give the entire film away.
That opening would be enough to stamp Sunset Boulevard as one of the great movies. I mean, it's one of the most striking, stirring openings I've ever seen in a movie.
The mansion was actually not in the 10,000 block of Sunset Boulevard, as Joe Gillis says in the beginning of the film. It was out on Wilshire and has subsequently been destroyed, but it was a fabulous old, if somewhat decrepit and unused house that was owned by the ex-wife of J. Paul Getty.
The inside of the house was totally created on a set, and it was an amazing set. And I'll tell you, one day I saw the cameraman take some, it looked like pumice, like marble dust, and he rubbed his hands and he went whoosh, in front of the camera to give it a kind of feeling that the corners were a little dusty. That was the kind of detail that was thought through by the creators of the film. I was amazed at that.
Wilder's camera style is very interesting. He's often been said to favor the screenplay over the image, and he certainly cared about his screenplays. His actors were never allowed to change a single word.
We never deviated from that script. There were no new lines for the next day. That was as tight a script as I have ever worked on. And what was fascinating to me, and I've never seen any script like it, was that in the left-hand column, there would be all the camera direction. In other words, Billy, in his writing, was directing.
I've been at Paramount 72 years. I started in 1928. And of all of the people on the lot, writers, directors, producers, executives, I don't think anyone has made such an impression on me as Billy Wilder. He and Charlie Brackett were writers on the lot.
Billy Wilder was a huge name in Hollywood in 1950. He'd already won an Oscar for The Lost Weekend. He'd made Double Indemnity. He'd made The Major and the Minor. A series of successful films.
You're Norma Desmond. Used to be in silent pictures, used to be big.
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
This was a very bitter film for Hollywood to look at because, of course, it was about Hollywood.
I think that what Billy was most concerned about was the fact that, that he might be perceived as betraying his colleagues and his own industry.
Some people loved it, some people hated it. The trade papers were mixed. Variety, I think, called it disturbing. Well, yes, it is disturbing. The Hollywood Reporter gave it a rave review. I said this is the kind of movie that really should be studied frame by frame. But the most famous story is the encounter between Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, and Billy Wilder, the director of the film, after an early screening.
Louis B. Mayer became absolutely incensed at one of these screenings and went up to Billy and said, you know, how could you do this?
Everyone in the screening, except for Louis B. Mayer, loved it. Mayer stomped out, headed to his car, and said to Billy Wilder on the way out, basically, you bastard.
And Billy had a famous retort.
I mean, it really was heated language because he was appalled at the image of Hollywood that Wilder was about to present to the American public. Billy Wilder always had a bitter and sardonic streak. When he was a screenwriter in Germany in the 20s and 30s, his films always had a bite to them, and he kept that bite when he came to Hollywood.
Then somebody pointed out to me that Wilder is probably the only Hollywood director at that time whose parents were consumed by the Holocaust. And so that's why there's always the dark element, even in comedies like Sabrina.
There was a time in this business when they had the eyes of the whole wide world. But that wasn't good enough for them. Oh, no. They had to have the ears of the world, too. So they opened their big mouths, and out came talk. Talk, talk.
Norma Desmond is one of the great characters ever created. I mean, she stands up in any kind of literature, movies. She's just one of the great characters.
Gloria Swanson was not the first actress that they approached.
He thought about Mae West, and he went to see Mae West, and of course she wanted to rewrite the dialogue she had done in all of her pictures. So that didn't do well.
They thought about Pola Negri. Too much Polish accent is the way Billy described it later.
Then he went to see Mary Pickford, who had been America's sweetheart and who was our first big star here at Paramount. And Mary always owned her own negative, so that knocked that out.
So they were really stumped until Wilder was having tea in George Cukor's garden one day, and Cukor said, well, what about Gloria Swanson? Perfect. Here is the character, exactly as written.
I'm sure all of the other people he thought about would have been good, but Gloria, this picture was made for Gloria Swanson.
She really had fallen out of the public eye by the time this film was made. So she was a has-been, and she was making her famous comeback. She claimed that she didn't really know what the role was when she accepted it. She thought at first that it was for a small part. Why would they want her to be the star of a picture in 1950? She hadn't really been on screen since the early 30s. So of course she immediately took them up on it, divorced her fifth husband or fourth husband or however many husbands she'd had at that point, and moved to Hollywood.
And she worked so hard. She was so dedicated. She was the only one, I think, of all of us that truly understood the importance of this film, what it could become.
Gloria Swanson wasn't the crazy diva she appears to be in the film. She's a hardworking actress, and she knew what she was doing. Nevertheless, it's a version of herself that she plays.
Gloria Swanson gave, I think, a fantastic performance.
I didn't know you were planning a comeback.
I hate that word. It's a return. A return to the millions of people who've never forgiven me for deserting the screen.
The part that William Holden plays in the picture, the gigolo part, was written for Monty Cliff.
And he actually accepted the role. He was filming The Heiress with Olivia de Havilland at the time, and he was very young and very famous and stark magnetism kind of thing. He went off skiing in Switzerland and thought about it a little bit, and perhaps on the advice of his agent, when he got back, he turned him down. So they approached William Holden, whose problem was that he'd made his big name in a film that had been made 10 years earlier, Golden Boy.
People forget, Bill Holden was really in a very frayed part of his career. It was a long time since he had done Golden Boy, since he was the great white hope.
So he was kind of a has-been himself at that point. He'd kept working, but nobody really noticed him. And Wilder met with him and really saw the intelligence and the character and the talent underneath this facade of all-American guyness. and turned out to be perfect. And I think he's even better than Clift would have been.
He was a much better choice than Clift would have been because you felt he was the all-American boy being corrupted.
Remember the scene where he comes in at the party and he's in that vicuna coat, and you just die. There's something about him that is so exquisite, really. For me, he's the linchpin of the film. He is the one who makes it really, really work because he is so real.
She's quite a character, that Norma Desmond.
She was the greatest of them all. You wouldn't know, you're too young.
Erich von Stroheim. Perfect casting.
Here's a great director of the 20s and early 30s, made fantastic pictures, but kind of blew it by making a film first called Greed, which was umpteen hours long and was truncated, and it was a big scandal and a big mess. And then by making a film called Queen Kelly, starring Gloria Swanson.
This was not some actor playing this part. This was a real person who had knowledge of all this.
Queen Kelly is the film that we see in her screening room when she shows Bill Holden her glorious past. And when she stands up in front of the image of herself on the screen and does that creepy gesture, it's even more creepy because that film was the one that ruined her career. Queen Kelly was financed by Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK and RFK, and he was also apparently Swanson's lover at the time. And she called him from the set of Queen Kelly and said, "Joe, come out here at once. A madman is directing this picture," by which she was referring, of course, to Erich von Stroheim.
To watch him on the set, he always arrived completely dressed in his costume, in his butler's uniform. He always wore his white gloves. And he sat in his chair, that we all had chairs with our names in the back, and he would look until he found his. I'd bounce around and sit on anybody's chair. Anyway, he would sit on his. He would inch his chair closer and closer to the camera because he was so fascinated with what Billy was up to.
After Queen Kelly, there was a great deal of bitterness between von Stroheim and Swanson, but by 1950 they appeared to have patched things up and there was apparently no rancor on the set at all. You know, they respected each other enough and had worked with each other long enough that they saw what was best in each other instead of what was worst.
You must understand, I discovered her when she was 16. I made her a star, and I cannot let her be destroyed.
Von Stroheim ending up a ruined film director acting as the star's butler actually was, in some sense, an accurate depiction of Erich von Stroheim at that time.
Hello, Mr. Sheldrake.
Hello.
On that basis loaded, I covered it with a 2-page synopsis.
Thank you.
But I wouldn't bother.
What's wrong with it?
It's from Hunger.
Nothing for Ladd?
It was just a rehash of something that wasn't very good to begin with.
I'm sure you'll be glad to meet Mr. Gillis. He wrote it. This is Miss Kramer.
The name is Schaefer. Betty Schaefer.
Nancy Olson, a contract actress again, was put in.
In the original screenplay, you can see that they hadn't figured out who was to play that character yet, and they called her simply a fresh face.
I went back to school in the fall, and I got a call saying that Mr. Wilder was doing a picture called Sunset Boulevard. And there was a role called Betty Schaefer, and they wanted me to play that part. As we used to say in Wisconsin, I think I knew that I had fallen into a tub of butter because Billy Wilder was already legendary at that time. I saw on the script that he had co-written it and that he was going to direct it. So I knew that I was very fortunate indeed.
She's totally winning in the film, really pretty and well-meaning, and adds the only element of real sort of heart that Hollywood shows to itself and to the outside world in the picture.
They used to call me Wholesome Olsen in school. And that is the quality that he wanted for Betty Schaefer.
She was really quite good, and she's one of those people that didn't get enough credit.
Where's Mr. DeMille shooting?
Stage 18, Miss Desmond.
Thank you, Jonesy. And teach your friend some manners. Tell him without me, he wouldn't have any job, because without me, there wouldn't be any Paramount studio.
You're right, Miss Desmond.
Go on, Max.
And when she came through our gate, to see Cecil B. DeMille in that very famous scene where she and Bill Holden are in the car and Eric von Stroheim is chauffeur them in, and she's coming in to be Cecil B. DeMille. It was really a return for Gloria to Paramount, and certainly to see Cecil B. DeMille.
Well, hello, young fella.
Hello, Mr. DeMille.
It's good to see you.
The last time I saw you was someplace very gay. I remember waving to you. I was dancing on a table.
A lot of people were. Lindbergh had just landed in Paris. Come on in.
When Cecil B. DeMille comes out of stage 18 to greet Gloria Swanson being driven on the lot by Eric von Stroheim, he looks at her and calls her young fella. And that was a very daring, warm, affectionate phrase that he always used with Gloria Swanson. Every time I'd meet her at the gate and bring her in to see him or to see Mr. Zucker, he'd always look at her and look her up and down and say, "Hello, young fella."
The key scenes of the film, in my opinion, are the scene in which Norma Desmond returns to Paramount after her long absence and is treated like the royalty she believes she is, and the people who work there believe she is, but is essentially forgotten by everyone else. It's a beautiful sequence. It's poignant but funny at the same time. One's laughing at her but feeling for her. And that's quite a remarkable mix of emotions to expect an audience to get, and Billy Wilder does get it. I don't think there was any love lost between Wilder and DeMille, but DeMille did agree to take the role.
I heard more movies in the Lux Radio Theater with Cecil B. DeMille, you know, announcing with his mellifluous voice. And when I heard his voice in Sunset Boulevard, you know, it was like a childhood memory.
He had a wonderful voice, and he had an air about him. He walked in the commissary and he was, oh, there's Cecil B. DeMille. You know, there was a thing, and cachet, that was just part of him. He loved doing Sunset Boulevard. He loved playing himself, and wasn't he wonderful? I thought he was just simply fabulous.
There were rumors that Cecil B. DeMille could be tough on a set. He could be.
I saw him all the time on the lot with his riding crop, not that he ever got on a horse, and his boots.
In the scene where he plays himself, and Gloria Swanson is coming back to the studio to have a meeting with him, and he was doing Samson and Delilah at the time on stage 18, it's interesting because in the scene, DeMille used all of his own staff.
I'll tell you a funny story. Cecil B. DeMille, I'm laughing when I'm saying this, considered me to play Delilah in Samson and Delilah. And thank God he made the right choice and he put Hedy Lamarr in that role. I could no more have played Delilah, my little virginal college girl here. For heaven's sake, it was ridiculous.
There's a scene in the film in which Norma Desmond's friends appear to play cards, and Joe Gillis, the Holden character, calls them the Waxworks because they too are has-beens. H.B. Warner, Buster Keaton, Anna Q. Nilsson, big stars of the silent era, and by 1950 they were essentially forgotten.
That is simply magical, isn't it? When you see these familiar faces from the past, and there they are intensely playing cards.
H.B. Warner, he had been in Cecil B. DeMille's King of Kings, and he played Christ, and everybody said that jinxed his whole career. What role can you play after you've played J.C.?
There was a contest sometime, I think, in the mid-'70s, and the contest asked the question, what was one of the most romantic scenes in a movie that you've ever seen? And that little balcony scene with Bill and myself won the contest. We shot it at night, and Billy invited Artis Holden, who was Brenda Marshall, but her name was Artis. And that was Mrs. Holden. I had never met Mrs. Holden, and I was now going to embrace her husband in a long, passionate love scene. And I was terrified. And Billy, he said, look, after the embrace, he said, do not come apart until I say cut. Now, he said, it's going to seem like a long time because what I want to do is I'm going to be doing a long dissolve. So this is really for the purpose of the camera and what I have in mind in my cutting. So he said, it's going to seem like a long time, but just please continue to embrace. And he pulls me into his arms, and we kiss, and we kiss, and we kiss, and we hold on. And it seems like an eternity. And all of a sudden, there's a female voice from down below that says, "Cut! Damn it! Cut!" And it was Artis Holden.
The New Year's Eve party is pretty bizarre. It's very unpleasant, in my opinion. She's hired a band. She's gotten all these expensive champagne, caviar, and Joe Gillis expects that it's a party. Well, it is a party, but there are only 2 guests. And he's a little freaked out by this because it begins to dawn on him just what it is that he's doing.
I thought that was an inspired scene and very hard to pull off. Really hard to pull off.
The other key scene, of course, is the final scene of the film, which turns out to have been the last scene that they filmed. Norma Desmond walking down the stairs, performing in what she believes to be her cherished Salome epic. Having killed her lover and employee, Joe Gillis, being filmed by newsreel cameras, which she believes to be Cecil B. DeMille cameras, and does that creepy kind of dance thing.
I was on the set when that happened. I thought, oh my God, what an interesting combination.
She had such a good time. I was on the set for that as well, when Norma Desmond comes down the stairs. And by the way, that was done in maybe 2 or 3 takes.
Everything clicked. It's one of those movies where I thought everything clicked.
America accepted the film to a certain degree. It was a reasonably big hit, but it didn't win the Oscar.
By the time the film came out, I was married. By the time the Academy Awards came around, I was pregnant. And I remember going to the awards pregnant. I did not expect Sunset Boulevard to win.
The fact that the film did not win the Oscar for Best Picture is in part a reflection of Hollywood's distaste for the subject matter, namely itself. But it was up against All About Eve, a terrific film, which did win.
It also remains a classic, All About Eve, but not in the category of Sunset Boulevard.
That year, I thought Sunset Boulevard was by far the best movie of the year. And a lot of my friends thought All About Eve was the best movie, and I used to argue with them and so forth and so on.
Sunset Boulevard did do very well in the subsequent years after its initial release, so much so that a Broadway musical, a grandiose Broadway musical starring Glenn Close, came onto the scene a couple of years ago. It was a huge hit.
I think the only reason why anybody attempted Sunset Boulevard the musical is that it is a musical. It's not trying to be the film, because you can't get any better than the film. I do think that, though, that they did work well together. One does not cancel out the other. I think they're, 2 different perspectives on a magnificent piece of material.
I just want to tell you all how happy I am to be back in the studio, making a picture again. You don't know how much I've missed all of you. And I promise you I'll never desert you again. Because after Salome, we'll make another picture and another picture. You see, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us. And the cameras. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
What this film is truly about is a very, very huge theme, which is universal, and that is opportunism and its consequences.
Everyone in the film is, to some degree, an opportunist. That's a polite way of putting it, in my opinion.
The very nature of this business is the exploitation of people and the consequences of that.
It's people who are willing to sell themselves out not only for the highest price, but for any price.
The test of time has kept this film alive in people's interest and excitement and fascination.
Oh, the film is a masterpiece.
It looks more real today than it did back then. It looks less gothic, less melodramatic, less flamboyant.
One of the things that's so interesting about Billy Wilder, in my view, is that he really bridges old Hollywood and new Hollywood. He's got all the grace, the structure, the beautiful use of language, the carefully constructed screenplays and images, with the bitterness and cynicism of our present time. These films that he made still work in front of audiences, and that's quite something. People now respond not only to the grace and the beauty of the films as well-made, well-crafted Hollywood, old-time Hollywood films, they also respond to the nastiness. And in that way, he was way ahead of his time.